We shall have two workshops and then a closing session at the very end of the last workshop. I will now hand over to Dr. Asami Miketa, the Senior Program Officer, Power Sector Investment Planning at the Arena Innovation and Technology Center, for an introduction to today's sessions.
Thank you, Angela. Nadine, can you help with the slide?
Asami, we can hear you well.
Thank you.
Just setting up the slides.
So good morning again. I would like to give just 5 minutes introduction of maybe our thought process that led us to today. You might remember that San Jose on the day one presented some of the recommendation or good practice that we have collected and we have synthesized. And that touched upon both participatory process and effective communication tools. So participatory process in the context of strengthening scenario development and effective communication tools in the context of improving scenario use. We have also heard last 5 years different example of how countries are practicing participatory process. We have heard from Chile in the past, a great example we will hear again today. We also heard, for example, like UAE doing interesting effective communication using some games. So we have learned quite a few examples already. And in the past LTES member survey, this has been always one of the top priorities that the country wanted to go deep dive. So we decided, we have promised that we are going to have this workshop. And just to start with our mental model, again, this was presented by San Jose on day one. So this is how we see that energy, long-term energy scenario is at the center, and sometimes energy modeling tools are used to feed into the scenarios, not always, but sometimes. And then that energy scenario is used for the energy policy making. And throughout this process, there's always stakeholder consultation. So that was how we started. But as we explored a little bit more deep into like different references, literature, communication with some, like we had a few brainstorm meetings, we have elaborated our mental model a little bit more. And we have put it in this way. So participatory process is to give input to all the process and also like to inform the previous steps. So policy making would give the inputs to the scenario making, and then scenario making process also gives inputs to the model. It's not always from tools to the scenarios to the policy making. But communication goes from the tools and scenarios and policy making, and then stakeholder communication goes one way to the stakeholder community. So we had that, and then we had brainstorm session in May this year at the Fraunhofer at the International Energy Workshop. So this is a workshop with scientific community. So the background of the people are a bit different from this kind of stakeholders that we have here. But we wanted to get like initial ideas because there's lots of scientific literature about these topics. So we wanted to test and how we can frame it better. And it was interesting. So again, like everything that we discussed there cannot be directly applied to the issue of like government use of scenarios. But some of the key highlights that we had was we defined what are the benefits of stakeholder participation. So it's really helpful to define the scope of models and scenarios because it also can help to limit the number of relevant scenarios. Also, scenarios itself, sorry, that's the stakeholder participation itself is also a great mean of communication. So sometimes we had participatory process and communication as a separate step, but it was emphasized that this can be actually one and the same thing. And stakeholder participation also helps to build trust and also increasing acceptance of the model results. Some challenges mentioned was that it's a resource intensive process, particularly for the scientific community, where the main interest is to produce scientific different papers. It's not always the priorities, and also there's not so much experience in this. But at the same time, they emphasize that it's getting more and more the case when they get public funds. There's always increasingly more often that stakeholder consultation is part of their research program. And as a method, we have heard that there's an interactive way using, I did not know this word before, gamification. So using some kind of game type of thing. And then visualization, this was mentioned by Denmark today. And also it was mentioned that it's important to have stakeholder consultation at the different geographical scales, local level, national level, and like regional level. There was also like some countries, some scientific community experience that it's maybe more helpful to have one-to-one closed session rather than like one open consultation. Another reason why we wanted to have this brainstorm session at the IW was we also wanted to find some scientists who can help us with this process. And we actually met James there. So we have been working with James in designing this session, and he will be with us for next few months to help us and advise us in putting these ideas together. This is my last slide. So I have shown you this mental model that has participatory process and the communication as a separate process, but now we have combined this and we take this approach of communication through participation. So we initially thought that we are going to have separate workshop on the participatory process and the communication, but we thought that maybe it doesn't really make sense to separate these two. So we are now having this as a mental model to move forward. So that's where we are. And with that, I would like to hand over to James to navigate through the whole day. So please welcome, James.
So, good morning, everybody in the room. I'm glad to see there's still a few of us here, and good morning to everybody online. So, I've been meeting Sami at various global energy systems modeling workshops over the last probably decade, I would say. Always interesting, usually at the International Energy Workshop during the summer and the Integrated Assessment Modeling Community Workshops in winter. I'm an engineer. I have absolutely no background in sociology or psychology, but we all develop our energy systems models to committed to have impact on policy. And so what I want to talk today about is what has emerged, I suppose, in the process from my research in participatory engagement without any fundamental background in this area, but learning how to do it as we went, and then co-creating long-term energy scenarios with communities from different types of communities, geographical communities or policy communities, talking in muddy boots to rural farmers in the west of Ireland, to talking to the President of the US and the White House, using different types of participatory engagement methods. I should also say, so I'm James Glynn. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy in Columbia University in New York, and I lead the Energy Systems Modeling and Data Analytics team at Columbia. So I'm going to split this out into 3 different sections. The first section is largely focused on research that was done in Ireland and the EU. The second section is very much community of energy systems modelers and how we develop energy systems modeling tools. And the last session is focused on the US and my experiences in participatory engagement and dialogue in the US over the last 2 years since I joined Columbia. So the outline, so in Ireland and the EU work, we developed and have been developing energy systems optimization models for well over a decade in Ireland, but always getting the insights and the numbers from policy or from the energy systems models into policy was always a struggle. But we've access in Ireland, given we're a small country, we're probably excessively friendly, that we're able to talk to our policymakers and have direct interaction, probably in a possibly unique way. And so this type of process has emerged from this level of interaction. We've recently developed a new energy systems model, Times Ireland model, that's been used quite iteratively with dialogue with different government committees, climate action committees. We had interactions with, I said, government committees, but also very small rural communities, exploring transdisciplinary approaches to participatory engagement, engaging not just with engineers and energy systems modelers, but engaging with geographers, sociologists, psychologists, and how do we actually vision and dream about our future, and then to bring that into our energy systems models. And as a result, the carbon budgets that come out of this process, come out of this model, have been enshrined in law. I'm going to talk a little bit about the IEA ETSAP very briefly, about the energy system modeling tools that we've used, new open source visualization tools that are useful that can link our models straight to GitHub, straight to websites, which mean we can really rapidly iterate and have a conversation with our different types of stakeholders in close to real time, depends how fast your model runs. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about dialogue with very high level politicians, decision makers, financiers in New York and Wall Street, and how dialogue is indispensable and valuable as part of this participatory process. So when I arrived on whatever day it was, Wednesday morning, I did the usual engineer thing of showing you lots of plot charts. When we're engaging with local communities, really to think about our communication tool and think of tools and our visualizations and think about how easily absorbative is that information. So we typically think, but when we're engaging with local communities, we need to think about all the different groups that are engaging in that decision-making process. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Okay. So typically, we're all up here, the nerds, the energy modelers, the experts, and we don't really like to engage with the public down here in the bottom left-hand corner. We don't really engage with them in what their visions of the future are, or what they think in their local community might be better. Don't really engage with their priorities. And when you do, some very interesting things start to emerge about what the scenario constraints, or what the drivers of your energy systems models, or what the constraints or externalities that may actually be far more relevant to a local energy systems plan than what we might think just typically looking at macroeconomic drivers and extrapolating those forward. So as Asami laid out, it can be a very time intensive, very labor intensive, but hugely fulfilling process when you get to engage with local communities and right up to presidents and government departments when you can integrate all these different conversations, these different processes together. So we typically start when we're at this local community. We reach out early on, send out surveys, try to build trust. Really important to build trust early on in the process, that we get buy-in with our communities, that they know that they are an important part of the process, critical part of the process, that we empathize with them. Again, these ideas of empathy and trust, not things as an engineer typically talk about in research, but hugely important in this process. Really enable scenario visioning, so something that we're going to do later on with Nadim, that we're start just plotting out ideas. What are the critical things for our visions for the future in that community? We often think about just what are the technologies, what are the energy demands, the heat demands, the energy service demands, but often things like housing and health and well-being and childcare starts to emerge out of these participatory processes, and how do we actually endogenize those types of visions into our models becomes very important. And this is all to say that we, talk and talk and talk again, and try to integrate these qualitative conversations ultimately into quantitative metrics that go into our models, and then try to cross-communicate between policymakers, civil society, and experts. But always bearing in mind what our stakeholders' ability to absorb information is. So really tuning in our visualization and communication processes to be relevant to our stakeholders. So I'm usually talking a little bit too much, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So when we start these processes, it's really about building relationships and getting a sense of where our stakeholders are coming from. So we ask these questions about what forms community engagement relative to climate action have you been involved in? What was that process like for you? Are there plans to run or be involved in further community engagement work? What would these look like for you? With respect to future thinking tools, what aspects would be useful and in what context, again, to you, to the stakeholder? And what forms of impact do you expect to draw from this community engagement initiatives? So as I said earlier on, and Asami alluded to, there's no best practice in this area. There's only kind of emerging ideas about how to do this properly. I feel a little bit naive maybe saying that there has been approaches over the last 5 years, but I haven't been here for the last 5 years. Our experiences are that this is just emerging in very transdisciplinary ways and learning as we go. So futures thinking outside of long-term energy systems modeling is a field that's growing, and it's trying to develop and enhance trust and collective visioning outside of just quantitative tools, but including qualitative metrics and narratives. It's trying to counteract uncertainty, ill-at-ease, anxiety around major social and societal issues around climate change and the way our communities are going to evolve. It's really useful to explore problematic trends, influences, culture issues stemming from the past in communities, to explore a problem about timing and when do we make crucial decisions, what are emergent dynamics in the community, how do we try to avert unforeseen events, and talk about agency and enable communities in their own visioning and planning for their future. So we developed a lot of very useful tools over this 2-year project that was funded by the Irish Environmental Protection Agency. And I don't have time to go through today, but the project was called Imagining 2050. If you go to imagining2050.ecc.ie, you'll find all these tools and far more information about how to use them, how to gather information. So the tools are very useful. It's a tool book. It's basically a PDF and instructions of how do you engage with local citizens, with social enterprises, with environmental activists, with local decision makers, government decision makers, and researchers. We have these guiding principles. So diversity is really important. Having an open invitation, not being too exclusive. That we create time and space for these conversations. That these spaces are caring, nurturing spaces, and they're accessible to those who might be underserved in our communities. They give us space for a voice, for gender equality, that are socially inclusive, and that different values and experiences are included in our discussions. Another guiding principle is having considered judgment. So we're trying to aim for fact sharing, for fact-based dialogue, and to include empathy for others in those types of conversations. As I said, there's lots of different tools here. I don't have the time to go through them all, but we had these 9 different tools that can be used, different visualization methods, different ways of bringing out the conversation and the dialogue with our stakeholders, different levels of complexity, different levels of data that can emerge, and then different levels of iteration and complexity with energy systems models. And this is all to say that we thought that or we learned that it was necessary to really bridge this gap in identifying the determinants and conditions for communities to engage in climate action, that they have access, to give them access to energy systems model insights that typically are just at utility level, CEO level, policy level, and government level. And that by plotting out these different determinants with these dreams and visions for communities' futures, identifying who the champions in those communities are, enabling them with the understanding of drivers and tipping points, education on policy, research, and how to communicate, really helps drive forward climate action at a local level that we hadn't seen previously. So I'm running way too slow, so I'm going to apologize, Shami, I'm going to be a little bit faster. So the next tool that we're using is integrated with the energy system, or the ETSAP community in the IEA. ETSAP is one of the technology collaboration programs. It's been running for over 40 years. It generates 2 different energy systems modeling codes, Marcal and Times. I think Marcal is only used by 1 country remaining, the US, and the rest are all using Times. Very useful tool for developing energy systems model pathways. Got very large government buy-in and increasingly commercial buy-in from different foundations interested in the energy transition. Also, these are the main tools that we're using at Columbia, advising financiers, investors, utilities in the US. I just want to talk very quickly about the model that we developed in Ireland, the Times Ireland model. So we developed this really state-of-the-art energy systems model using Times, but we developed it in a very different way to how energy systems models and Times models have been generated in the past. So it does all the usual stuff. It's macroeconomic drivers, databases for technologies in the future, economic growth, what are the capacity investments and the environmental emissions that are coming out of our projections for the future. But we really worked hard on making the model as transparent as possible and as iterative as possible. So the model is freely available for anybody to use. It's on GitHub. It's very well documented. The documentation is peer reviewed. And as I said earlier on, we have this interactive dashboard. So we can literally download the model on GitHub, run it, change a scenario, upload the result files to this website. It'll doable in about half an hour. And that was the process that we did when we were reviewing and developing our model. So we had each different expert group, different industry sectors, different government sectors, different community sectors were able to visualize and see these results, review where they thought our input data was rubbish, tell us why it should be better, and ultimately got much more political buy-in. So we got buy-in from different government stakeholders, buy-in from communities that these models are actually useful and that they're not, coming from the man trying to foist on policies upon communities that don't otherwise want them. So it was a very useful communication tool. And the last thing I'll say then on this is that we developed these levels and abilities to communicate, largely very data intensive. But through that process, I suppose it's really important to learn ability for dialogue, for trust, for empathy, and again to communicate in ways that our stakeholders need. I used to be absolutely brutal at just presenting more and more engineering data, that more data was better. It is not true. So really thinking very carefully about how you communicate, the kind of nesting your data in ways that's time efficient for very busy people to absorb, having it absorbable on different levels is really important, but also making sure that you are open and engage with your different policymakers, being willing to travel, to have very public conversations on the record at government committees, but also having very private and delicate conversations with presidents, with Wall Street, with investment funds that they need to know what's coming. They even today, often some of the largest investment funds in Wall Street are underestimating the pace of the transition. So being able to have this participatory engagement, to engage with them, tell them what the pace of the transition needs to be based on science, and then iterate with them that they have the capital to put it where it needs to go, is, I suppose, the last level of participatory engagement that we've been engaged in. So we've gone from Ireland farmers to some of the biggest investment firms in Wall Street. Very happy to talk more about those engagements and what they look like, and the types of data and the types of relationships and trust and empathy that I think are key tools in that whole process. Sorry, I've gone a little bit over time, but that's my 10 cents or 2 cents on participatory engagement and how we're learning to do it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nadeem. And thank you, James, for that introduction to the participatory process. And it reflects a bit of my personal growth because I started as the engineer and I was with the boring kids, the nerds, the experts that you showed up there. And then I joined the cool kids who talk about the participatory process for quite a long time with the World Energy Council. So just to give you an idea of what are the elements within the participatory process itself is you touched upon the stakeholders. So we have that very fundamental group. Who is part of the energy system? Who do we want to talk to? We have different styles of formats because not everybody responds to the same kind of format. Yeah. So different engagement formats, tools, very interesting point because some tools bring out the best in people and the framework for dialogue. So which frame are you in? What are you thinking of? As a techno-economic person, I had very specific way of looking at the energy model. We were talking about technology costs. We're talking about the normative approach where we want to hit a particular target, carbon emissions, and so on. But when we talk about the energy system, it's really about for the people and the planet. So there's a lot of social political elements that needs to come in. So the framework of the dialogue is very critical to really capturing those uncertainties, those trends, and really getting that out of your stakeholders. All of this feeds into the scenario narratives, which of course has to interact with the energy modeling framework as well. And not everything can be modeled, of course, but we have to get there to try, especially if we understand that those specific sectors outside the energy conversation can impact the process. So these are the cool kids I work with, the Energy Council, and they are in the process of doing participatory, engagements, and it's a community-driven organization. So we have different kinds of communities which are kept alive through the machinery of the council in many ways. So we've got the member committees, which are over 90 different countries which are represented, and those member committees can have diverse fabrics. So it could be the Ministry of Energy, where I used to work with in the United Arab Emirates, who's the MC, also participating in the LTES. So we've got ministerial representation. It could be business community because there are industrial associations, the energy companies who are part of it. We also have the innovation community, so the startup ecosystem. What are they doing, and what are the conversations they are having? And the most dynamic bit I like to work with is the future energy leaders, who are the future leaders at the front lines of the energy transition, and their conversations and their perspectives are very different from that of typical energy modelers. So tools, coming to the tools, a bit was touched upon yesterday by my colleague Marius in the geopolitical session, but just to give a quick insight into why this is important for the participatory process, and James has also touched upon it. You have a pre-engagement with the community before you arrive at the participatory process. What are the tools we use for them? One is Pulse. Pulse was trialed in 2016 as, getting a quick snapshot of what the energy sector stakeholders are thinking of in the moment. Issues monitor is a very annual process where we talk about a horizon scanning. So it looks at what are your action areas, what are keeping the energy leaders busy, and what's keeping them up at night. So what are the uncertainties that they're dealing with as well. So that gives you a issues monitor that the policymakers or all members of this energy ecosystem can interact with. So it's an interactive one, updated annually through this membership network that we have. The trilemma, my first interaction with the council has been with the trilemma, which is an annual update of how balanced is the energy space in that country. So we talk about energy security, equity, and environmental sustainability. So how well are those indicators doing, and are they in balance? And it's a very intriguing question today in the moment that we are in. So if you have one pillar very overly focused on, probably the other pillars of that trilemma might, or the tripod would fall off. Then we have the energy scenarios, the transition scenarios. I'll go into a bit of the details of that. And then the interesting bit of the radar. So it's not about just getting to the participatory process and leaving. We have touched upon how to communicate our scenarios further. How do you keep the community engaged with our scenarios? And in 2021, during the COVID crisis, we created the post-COVID recovery scenarios. And to augment that process, we created what's the WEC radar, where we allow the community to basically hashtag the different signals they see from the ground over the time and attach it to the four scenarios we identified for the post-COVID recovery. So the community is having a tool to kind of engage with, and that provides us with a check-in on which space are we going into, what are the different regions doing, because different regions have different preferences. And the last bit is a bit more focused on moving from a global and regional perspective to really going down and saying, this is the particular policy focus that we want to communicate with our stakeholders. And there we have created a scenario simulator where we have role plays. It's in a way a game which can allow people to think within the narratives and bring their perspectives in. And the good bit is you get the data out of it. So you can do something about the data, model it, link it to energy modeling frameworks as well. Now here comes the frameworks. Here comes the frameworks for dialogues. This is where they're saying that there are some questions, or there's a frame that you need to bring people into and have a guidance over the dialogue. Otherwise, you wouldn't get what you're looking for. And here we have the scenario archetypes. Three key scenario archetypes from the energy transition scenarios is hard rock, modern jazz, and unfinished symphony. So modern jazz is where the markets drive things forward. So that's the main dominant tool for action. Unfinished symphony is where the governments, are the strong driver for moving forward. Hard rock is a very inward-looking scenario where the policymakers and the markets try to figure things out, but really the focus is the local content. And in many ways, within our community, we say the world is right now in a very hard rock situation because we do consider fragmentation and how that impacts trade and energy flows. With the constellation of disruptions, which tries to really capture and harness what the innovation space is trying to do. So, but even there, we don't focus on just talking about the technology, but we also talk about business models. How are these new technologies getting to the market? Social behaviors. How is the consumer or the end user interacting with this technology? And of course, policy and regulation, which makes it happen. So when we provide this kind of frame of thinking, the kind of responses that we get to it are very unique and different, region to region, community to community. And of course, the latest is our domain map, which was briefly touched upon yesterday, where we have, the climate change boundary as well as the geopolitical social license for behavior. And the trilemma, of course, sits at the heart of this process because we realize the trilemma has and brings, useful thought process into the conversation. Because policymakers, when we go back with our scenarios and our numbers, they're going to ask you about energy security. Is it meeting that target? How well is it doing with sustainability? So the trilemma does provide that framework, and that's embedded into the scenarios thinking process as well. In terms of the engagement format, so Like I said, Future Energy Leaders has got a lot of energy in them, and we interact through the Visionario program. We have a map, gap, zap based process with them. They start with conducting a comparison of 30 different long-term scenarios, and that has enabled creating the understanding of theory of change, what changes and what creates the energy transition itself. We have scenario working groups, very similar to the LTS style, where we interact regularly with our MC community who have nominated experts to the process. We conduct expert deep dives to have a understanding of the regional, differences, local differences as well, and regional deep dives where we apply all of our tools in integrated form to produce scenario narratives. And of course, we try to use a scribe these days with most of our conversations to capture it in a way that can be communicated to the wider audience. This bit was presented by our partners, PSI, in the May dialogue, where we talk about how it fits into the modeling perspective. One simple example that I can highlight is the hard rock scenario. Yeah, so when we talk about hard rock and we say that it's a fragmented world, in the modeling perspective, it's represented as trade restrictions in terms of how the energy is traded between the world regions. So in many ways, when we think from a very broad framework, we will figure a way to convert these qualitative understandings into quantitative bits of the model that we interact with. And just to highlight the COVID scenarios, I know Nadine had spoken about it or asked about it yesterday. So it is a product of the participatory process that we maintain with our community. Yeah? So we heard from the community that they are concerned about the post-COVID recovery. So then we go in with a pulse tool. We start with understanding what are the trends. We used a simple 2x2 metrics to kind of capture the various ways and trajectories that the world is going into, and we supplement it with the radar, which tries to pick up the signals from our community, which is pinned towards the four, which is re-record, fast forward, rewind, and pause. And interestingly, of course, fast forward is the green kind of growth that we see, the green recovery plans, and the second bit is the re-record, which is a very interesting fourth archetype, as we would call it, which is not just about markets or governments. It's also about the community and how the community is driving the agenda of the energy transition. And that was the second biggest part of the pie, which was giving us very strong signals that it is about humanizing element of the energy transition. It's about the people as well who need to respond to the policies and market signals. And from there, and so the participatory process is in a very circular motion. So what we hear from the community feeds into the scenarios narrative and keeps us going to reinvent and really capture and represent what we see on the ground. These are examples of what we did with the simulator. So the elements of the simulator is we've got the four key roles, which is business, civil society, governments, and investors. We adapt the particular policy question and focus into options, into a menu of options. And the idea is that each of the roles, given their agendas, would have different preferences across these policy options. So that's what we try to tap into and see if over courses of conversation, do we change positions of the participants? Do they understand what the other role has to face when we are dealing with a particular policy option? And what are the implications for that in terms of the national energy transition? So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Hope I've given you some thought for the rest of the day. And it's surprising that it's been 5 years since the LTS. I didn't realize it's been so long. And been quite fortunate to be part of the LTS in different roles. And quite interesting that the conversation is going the way it is. Thank you.
Vishma, you're not allowed to go anywhere. We have to answer some questions. So we're running a little bit behind time, so we're going to change up the schedule a little bit. We're going to take 5 to 10 minutes of questions now on 2 presentations from myself and Vishma. And then we're going to make everybody uncomfortable by having to have a workshop together and talk to each other about participatory engagement. We're going to reorganize the room and do some experiments with the World Cafe. We're going to do that for 3 rounds for 15 minutes. And then the champion that emerges from each team is going to present the findings back to the room, both in the room and those of you online, you're not getting away either. So for the next 10 minutes, have we any questions on the presentation so far, either those in the room or online? Yes.
The question, very nice presentation indeed. Thank you both. Very interesting insights. Regarding the modeling of trilema, because we have no experience on it. What is the difference between this one and the USET, the unit commitment and economic dispatch or Dixieland model? This has to do with other sectors other than electricity as well, as I understood, or it's only.
So yes, the trilemma is beyond the electricity sector. It is for the whole energy sector. And at the moment, it is a historic snapshot. So it looks at the data that's come out annually from the energy space. So it's not forward looking, but we are in the process in some countries to link it to forward looking models. So we do have that examples. But the trilemma report as such is wider than that space. But elements such as the electricity prices, accessibility, and all of that feed in to the trilemma as well.
Thank you. It's for you, James. You very briefly mentioned that carbon budgets are now enshrined in law. Could you elaborate on what that means in itself and also what it means for the work that's been done?
Sure, thank you. So on the carbon budget side, so my previous colleagues in University College Cork in Ireland running optimization models there for 10 years, engaged probably on a weekly basis, if not on every other weekly basis, taking trips from our university to different stakeholder meetings, be that the power system operator, be that the Department of Energy and Climate Action, be that the President's Office, the Taoiseach is the Prime Minister in Ireland. And over the last 4 or 5 years, with that really engaged participatory process, really helped engage and inform the Department of Energy and Climate Action on the science, first off, of climate change. I think a lot of national policymakers still think that the carbon intensity and what the annual emissions is what's important, rather than what the cumulative emissions is what is really important. That's what the science says. For every trillion tons of emissions, cumulatively we go up 0.5 of a degree. So bringing that global insight of understanding the global atmospheric physics, and bringing that down to a national model to really help define national level policies is where that interaction between IEA ETSAP at the global level and down at the national level then to put those cumulative carbon budgets into policy. Then the relationship, the trust and the empathy, I suppose, gave the politicians the confidence that they were getting the best advice from science as to the annual emissions targets are not best scientific practice, that carbon budgets are what needs to happen globally, and so Ireland should be doing what needs to happen globally, locally. The policy is really difficult, and they're already, collectively Ireland is already failing at it. We're still rising in emissions, which means different sectors, the agriculture sector, the power sector, are going to have to go even faster to meet those targets. They're legally binding, but nobody can go to jail for it. But what it will mean is that politically somebody will have to stand up and say, we failed, which has consequences. So I think that's the short version of that story. Brad.
Hi, sorry, Brad Little from Natural Resources Canada. I just wondering if you can provide a sense of magnitude when you're talking about engagement on the times TIM model. Like I think there was one line within one of the slides that recognized that this engagement can be time intensive, resource intensive. So how do you balance that? Like you go out to, what sort of feedback do you get received there?
Again, we're very lucky. So I need to acknowledge a couple of people. Professor Hammond Daly, the Times Ireland Modeling Group in UCC. Alexander Balak is the lead modeler developer. He developed all the transparency tools, bringing the model onto GitHub, bringing the real-time visualizations. So those are 2 key people, and there's about another 5 people in the team, all PhDs, working a lot. I would say that that team, Hannah and Olex, and maybe one of the other professors, probably spent 20 to 30% of their time in meetings with government officials, with NGOs. They probably spend 2 hours a night in an evening on their couch on Twitter, engaging with people. Like, it's really time intensive, but it pays dividends. But there's all these relationships that need to be built up outside the modeling and outside the science that opens doors that otherwise would be in our silos. Do you want to comment on that?
I was just thinking of the numbers in terms of the surveys that we do. So the Pulse itself, we had like 600 respondents, but we have a whole unit which takes care of Pulse to run the Pulse and keep that updated. The issues monitor is run by 90, all the 90 MCs, but there we use the support of those MCs to conduct that issues monitor out there. So it's a really, you have to create the institutional design to keep that, process alive, and that you have you don't reach fatigue, but you keep the stakeholders interested enough to keep going and communicating. The new bit that we're now introducing is a Delphi process, a Delphi study, where we can also map causalities, understand those causalities, get a bit more on the trends, quantitative numbers on these qualitative bits, which we can't really model. But again, we do rely heavily on our stakeholders and the entire institution in terms of the regional managers, the MCs, and all of them to support this dialogue.
Just going to take the opportunity that this kind of goes for everybody, that typically scientific funding, be that from governments or scientific foundations that fund academic research, don't fund that engagement enough, either direct funding between researchers and government, and certainly not enough between enabling communities to feed back in that process. We know that the feedback loop is really important. We know it's really time intensive, which means it's really capital intensive. And so there's a lot of just volunteering going on from very time poor people, but really see the impact and the benefit of it. So that's another feedback loop into the research agencies to fund that process so that we're getting the best process and the best science. So let's say we've one last question, because I'm really being very poor at chairing this session. Have we any last questions, or anybody online? Question online.
Okay. Here from Irina, maybe a question for both of you. What do you think is the role of, let's say, journalism in all this participatory process? Because oftentimes journalists are the one communicating to the media and basically to the public, and how can we engage with them, not just in terms of energy scenarios, but basically the whole conversation surrounding the energy world.
Just in terms of practical terms, when I look into the radar that was created, a lot of the signals are what the journalists put out there, what our MCC is suitable to peg into the radar. At the same time, you're right that in each country and in each region, the kind of messaging which the journalists bring out on the energy transition can be quite varied and quite diverse. In some places, it's about energy security. That's the most blaring message. In some places, about energy affordability. But you're right, they are very important as a feedback source into to making sure that, or to follow the trajectory that the scenarios are taking in different parts of the world.
I'm going to jump in on that as well. It's a very useful point. I spoke a lot about relationships and dialogue, and the emergent thing I see from this process is that we can write all our academic papers and we might get 5 citations or 15 citations. You then summarize that in 800 words in the national paper of record, be that the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Irish Times in Ireland. You get a lot more traction, which as an academic is quite disappointing, but you ultimately get more policy action and more traction. Like, we have published reports, 800 pages, they've been couriered to our policymaker, they've sat on the shelf for a month. Then we summarize it in the for a journalist. We have a half an hour conversation. Next morning, we've got the government secretary saying, "Oh, we need to talk about that." So there's all these non-academic processes and relationships that are really critical to making sure that you have the impact that you model. So, yeah, that you're directly injecting the model insights to where it needs to go. And I think we're just still learning that, but yeah, cultivating those relationships with journalists is very important. Ones that you trust that will actually represent your research properly. That's the last question.
Thank you. Without knowing too much about your respective organizations, I still have a feeling that you have a lot of authority, that you get to decide amongst yourselves how do we invite others in to give input. Uh, Being a government agency, we don't have, I believe, the same option as you guys do, which hinders our work in some way. So my question is whether you know of any strategies for government agencies, organizations that we can deploy.
So I'm going to draw from my previous experience with the government. And you're right, there is a restriction on who are the stakeholders you can bring around the table. And with the council, my experience has been that if you design Chatham House rules where you use, well, we try to use a simulator actually as a tool to bring everyone around the table, and you give them different roles to play, so they're not bound to say exactly what they are saying, or from space of authority. So you kind of break those barriers and create such an engagement format. It's easier for people to want to come, and it's easier to get that stakeholder list as wide as you want. So that kind of format for discussion generally helps.
I'll just repeat that. I think privacy and trust and empathy, whether it's Chatham House rules around a secure executive committee meeting room or a loud dinner, but somewhere that, again, that is trust, that is secure, that you can have those conversations privately. All this participatory process is useful for engagement, but it doesn't all have to be public eyes, and certainly in government, there's definitely needs for it to be private.